Good morning. You're listening to Drinking Socially, the official Untapped podcast.
Your weekly look into what's happening in the Untapped community and the world of beer.
This episode is brought to you by Untapped and the Untapped merch store. Make sure to use the coupon code podcast to get 20% off your next purchase there. And while we're at it, I'm John, and in this episode, we're featuring some pretty cool things. A black lager with a really cool story. Cool ship. Cool. I'll pause for laughter later. Maybe more exciting, we're introducing a new format to the show, which is going to provide weekly episodes of Drinking Socially starting right now. You can expect to see some new segments sprinkled into our new format. Ranging, we're looking for maybe some styles, some segments that hit more on education. Harrison's going to introduce a BJCP format coming up in this episode, and also focus more on what we love, which is laughing. So stick around for episode 19 as we drink a dark lager. We cover fermentation in Beer 101. And all right, let's get to the beer. Harrison, tell us what we've got to drink here on episode 19.
That's right. So we're starting out with something pretty cool, as you've already jumped on that pun wagon quickly. It is from OEC Brewing. It's their Coolship Lager Black. And they're out of Connecticut. And I'm not cool enough to say their Latin name, or Ordinem Ecentrici Coctores is what OEC stands for. Kind of. I think I nailed it.
You sound like Harry Potter.
Yeah, right now. Expelliarmus, Lumos. Its ABV is 5.4%. And from the brewery, it's a Czech-style black lager. So that's interesting. And they say that our Coolship Lager Black gains its signature color from the use of European roasted malts, brewed using a traditional double decoction mash and hopped with fine European noble hops. After the boil, it rests in our copper Coolship for an hour and then is transferred into our Bodylak cooler and our open tanks for fermentation. After a cool fermentation using classic Czech lager yeast, it is cellared for several months prior to release. So, OEC is kind of known for doing crazy beers like this, but we'll talk about it in a sec. John, you already got in there. What's your first sip? What's your thought? What's happening?
Ooh, okay.
Ooh.
At my first sip, it was kind of smokier than I initially thought it was going to be. Of course, I think lager first, but there is some severe, it makes me want to barbecue. But as I drink and as I finish, I'm thinking about licorice more than I thought I would. Harrison, what about you?
Oh, yeah, sure. I get the smoke. It's kind of nutty to start, almost like an almond, a specific nut, if I will, an almond cashew hybrid or something. It's good. It's but almonds kind of have that tannin-y, which can almost be a roasty kind of thing going on with them as well. But I get like a dark bunch of roasted kind of nuts. This is delicious. Nicely carbonated too. It's very kind of bubbly on the tongue. So something cool we're going to do moving forward with these beers is kind of put up the BJCP style alongside it. And if you guys don't know what the BJCP is, I'm going to tell you a little about it right now. So it stands for the Beer Judge Certification Program. It's a nonprofit, started in 1985, and their mission is to promote beer literacy and the appreciation of real beer and to recognize beer tasting and evaluation skills. So they kind of are like the official, unofficial, dictionary, if you will, or encyclopedia, a great resource for if you are trying a beer for the first time, a style you never had. Look up what the BJCP says about it. They'll have kind of like the industry standards laid out right there for you. And so John's going to kind of tell us a little bit about this beer itself. Kind of jumps through a couple different categories, but we pulled up what the BJCP says about them to give us kind of a baseline as we drink through this.
Yeah, I think this is something I'm kind of excited about. Harrison and I have drank many different styles on the podcast. getting to season 3, episode 19. And I think I'm excited to just talk a little bit about the style. Now, on our inaugural BJCP highlight, this beer is marketed by OEC as a dark European lager. And that's not an official style that I could find recognized by the BJCP, but I chose to kind of compare it to an American dark lager. We know there'll be some difference, and I'm going to excitedly ask Harrison what he thinks. But breaking down an American dark lager, the place I wanted to begin was with the flavor. And this is something, if you were a certified beer judge, you would compare. You'd look at this flavor description. And so the makeup for an American dark lager, you should be looking for moderately crisp with some low to maybe moderate levels of sweetness. And I think we found that in this beer. Certainly crisp, sweet, but not overly done. You can get medium to low to almost no caramel or roasted malt flavors, and I got a lot in this one with that kind of smokiness, a little bit of molasses up front, and hop flavors. In a beer like this, the hop flavors generally range from nothing at all to barely significant. The hop bitterness, you might get a little bit more hop bitterness. You should taste no diacetyl. It might have a little bit of fruitiness. And it actually says that burnt or moderately strong roasted malt flavors are a defect. So if you're getting something that tastes kind of burnt, don't attribute that to the darkness of an American dark lager. That may be a defect in the style.
Interesting.
From here, I'm going to pivot to aroma, which is another thing I love to kind of experience in a beer. Style guidelines for American dark lager: little to no malt aroma, almost medium to low, so not a whole lot of roast or caramel aroma. You can get a little bit of hop on the nose, not much. You might get a little bit of spicier floral hop presence, and the hop aroma itself, right? When you smell that beer on an IPA, a mosaic hopped IPA, you're going to smell that cantaloupe right away. For this beer, they're saying you're not going to get very much of that at all, but you can get a little bit of the yeast character from the beer, which might hit you kind of like green apples. A lot of times would be a fair descriptor there.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So, some commercial examples of an American dark lager. The one that I know most is Shiner's Bock.
Shiner Bock.
Exactly. That's a beer, if you've never had before, it's worthy of trying. It's kind of it makes me think of Texas. You can find Beck's Dark or St. Pauli Girl Dark, Warsteiner's Dunkel. So there's a good range of commercial examples for an American dark lager. But Harrison, we said this one's listed as a Euro dark. Is there any insights that you might have into what we could expect a little bit differently? I almost wanted to compare this with like a German Schwarzbier.
That's what I would kind of put it up right against, as a German Schwarzbier. You know, the Czech lager yeast is a little bit different there. You obviously were brewing a German Schwarzbier, you wouldn't use a Czech lager yeast, but that's become Czech lager yeast have really kind of taken off in the States now, probably for the past 5 or 10 years or so. It's kind of known for like a nice long kind of rounded finish, and it's most famous in Pilsners, like Pilsner or Kel, which is a Czech Pilsner from the Czech Republic. But because the bitterness of that Pilsner is really kind of evened out by how rounded and kind of smooth a Czech lager finishes, which is great. So you've got kind of complementary things happening there. So, but it's different than an American lager that may use an American lager yeast, where it's going to be perhaps smoother and not play with the hops as much. Now, as you said, there's not much hops going on, in this beer at all, which is great as well. You don't need it. It's definitely more malt forward, toasty. I'm actually getting a lot of chocolate happening now as I'm drinking it currently, as it warmed up a little bit. But yeah, it's kind of this. It's really interesting. I've never had a black lager with Czech yeast before, Czech lager yeast in it. So I'm kind of like trying to find, I've had Czech lagers before, I've had Schwarzbier and dark lagers. I'm trying to kind of, as I'm drinking this, kind of see if I can pick out what's coming from what, the yeast, the malt, all that stuff. And then of course this was cooled in a Coolship too, which adds a whole other element to this beer that you have to kind of account for as you're drinking it. And what you're tasting and why. So it's really a neat style. And again, OEC is known for kind of just doing things their own way. But reading about it, I was like, I don't think I've ever had this combo before. So I was excited to drink it, kind of see what that actually tasted like. And it's great. It's very smooth. And yeah, now it's like a chocolate nut bar almost.
Yes. The flavor's certainly changing as it's kind of warmed up in my tulip a little bit.
And I'm even getting, like a little more grassy hop note now, just a little bit right at the end, just a little bit.
They said in their description on Untapped, European fine noble hops, which immediately makes me think of that. Like we're not talking about fruity hops, but that kind of grassy. Yep.
Yes, it's definitely there. That's cool.
And one of the guys who's in the Drinking Socially group was just recently at OEC's brewery. I didn't get a picture of the copper Coolship, but can you just, we're going to talk about fermenting here in a little bit, but aside from being a really cool name, Coolship, can you give us just a brief kind of, we talked about mashing in and stuff with Elliot on the last Beer 101.
Absolutely.
When you're cooling in a Coolship, mainly I imagine that just smelling magical in the brew house.
Yeah, there's a wonderful video if you have your fancy internet machine handy, all you listeners out there, and want to jump on. Allagash has a Coolship too, and they do a really cool video that shows the house, the Coolship building. They actually open the windows to when they knock out, they transfer a beer that's hot coming out of the kettle into the Coolship and use it to cool it down. But the thought behind it is, so it's basically a large copper swimming pool, except it's only about an inch or so deep. So you want no diving allowed for many reasons. But definitely. And so the thought behind it is when you get the beer that's hot coming out of the boil into this Coolship, the surface area, how large the Coolship is, the surface area allows the beer to contact the ambient air, contact more of the air, and cool it down with the ambient air, as opposed to running it through a plate chiller or cooling it down some other way in a brewery. And before you had commercial refrigeration and other ways of cooling beer down, this is how a lot of breweries had to do it. And a lot of breweries in Belgium still do, all over the world. Obviously, OEC is doing it in Connecticut, so it's not limited to just Belgium. And if you're asking, okay, so what if it's the middle of the summer? Can I use a Coolship then when it's 9 degrees out? You really can't. That's a big part of this. And there was a great article that Cantillon was interviewed for a couple of years ago about how climate change is kind of pushing back their brewing window, because they brew a beer and they can't cool it down quick enough now, like in September, like they used to. So yes, that's a factor, because you are just using the ambient air to cool it down, which is so amazing. Yes, you walk in that room, right? It smells like a brew house. It's one of my favorite smells in the world. So to have a whole room just kind of like a sauna, you can imagine 200-degree water wort hitting a room and the steam that creates, especially if it's cold out. That's going to be the best sauna experience ever. Just don't dive in, don't stick your finger in it. At that point, the beer's got to do its thing, and you want to keep it pristine for the yeast you want in there to do its thing, as opposed to something funky messing it all up.
That just makes me want to go diving into a 1-inch pool.
Just be careful.
And I know that wasn't the point of your story. These guys have put together a really cool brewery. As Harrison and I would struggle with the Latin pronunciation of their name. It's kind of maybe an intentionally incorrect Latin sentence that kind of refers to the order of the eccentric boilers. And it implies, and I haven't been able to do enough research to tie it all together, but somehow OEC is connected through tertiary cousins with breweries in Japan and Belgium through this kind of order.
Right.
And
That's
it almost
right.
makes me feel like I'm playing an Assassin's Creed video game as well.
Yes. You know too much, John. They're going to take you out.
As long as I can jump off a building and land into a haystack one time before they get me.
That's right. Not interested at all. Not a scratch on you. Yeah. Yes, that's right. They do. I remember that. You bring this up. The kind of network they have with, I think it's like 12% Beer Project and the Shelton Brothers. So like a lot of really cool, or maybe B12 imports. Anyway, a large organizations that have connections with breweries all over the world. To start, I believe this is right. Let me check myself here quickly. Whatever. Google this. But
disclaimer.
For a while, so I know this, for a while, OEC was getting fresh wort shipped to them from Belgium, and they were just blending a lot of it there. Either at the same time or before they started brewing their own beer, they started out really as like a blendery, which was really cool. Really cool to see that, to see a blendery in the United States getting, wort and fresh beer from Europe, from Belgium, from places like Cantillon and Fatome, and like actually doing something here with it. That's how I first heard about them, where I was like, what they're doing? How do they do that? How are they? And then as you said, the kind of connections they have, you learn about that, and you can kind of see how it's easy is relative, but to pick up the phone and say, hey, Cantillon, what do you got? Send it over. We're ready to put in some barrels. But that's what they did.
That it seems like an unfair advantage, but I guess it was an earned advantage. And at the end of the day, what I'm drinking here, I reference all of my dark lager experiences to New Belgium's 1554. That was the first one that I ever remember having.
Mm-hmm.
It probably isn't the first one I had, but I remember vividly thinking, no way that's going to taste refreshing. And after my second or third pint saying, what the hell is going on in your bar? Please teach me more. That was a really cool experience.
That's a great point. I have a similar memory to that of the Coctores Schwartz beer from Germany, where I think I'm saying the brewery name right, where that was one of the first dark, like black lagers I ever had. I had a liter of it at a beer hall in Philadelphia, and I was like, what? It was almost like there's before dark lagers and after dark lagers. There's the only two states of existence, one can have. And I was like, holy cow, this is chocolatey, but it's not heavy like a stout. It's kind of refreshing like a lighter lager, but the mouthfeel somewhere in between. And it was, it's a really cool style. And it's reminding me of that, especially again, now it's opened up a little bit. That kind of chocolatey, but still refreshing somehow. Mind puzzle. How is this working? The magic of roasted malts.
Seriously. And I'd like to sit here and muse on them with you, but we've got another thing I want to cover with you before we get too long into this episode. Beer 101.
Yes.
I think this is the 7th. We're getting close to the finish line.
We are.
This one covers fermentation science, and that's my terrible transition into Beer 101 episode 19.
Let's do it.
So every beer we've ever drank has been fermented. Is that safe to say out loud, Harrison?
Yes, that we've had. Oh, yeah. Yep, for sure.
And it goes back to before we even really knew what fermentation happened. Like the Germans made a law about what you can put in your beer before we understood what yeast did. So before we dive into wherever this conversation takes us, Harrison, if we understand that fermentation is the actual science, where we take all the work from the Brew Day episode, we've got a wort, we've cooled it down, and we're going to make something that's going to help me get through another season as a Bills fan. Can you begin this Beer 101 by explaining what do we mean when we talk about fermentation? Like what's happening in there?
Yeah, so high level fermentation is the process by which the yeast is converting the simple fermentable sugars we just collected from the mash into the wort. and put in a fermenter into ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide into CO2. And that's what gives the beer both its alcohol content and then some of its carbonation. Most breweries will do that later. They'll force carbonate their beer, but it is a byproduct of fermentation. So you could, like some breweries you've had on, namely Red Oak, get all your CO2 from just that yeast doing what it does, eating some sugar, making some alcohol, and making some carbon dioxide as well.
Just an incredibly natural approach. A lot of home brewers, I would imagine, go through and rely on natural fermentation to put the bubbles in my beer.
I mean, it's harder to capture than you'd think because CO2 wants to be a gas. It's always trying to escape for the liquid that it's being created in during fermentation. So a lot of homebrewers will you can force carbonate it or put like priming sugar, which is just like corn syrup, cane sugar rather. You can use maple syrup, lots of things, but into the bottles of your home brew as you bottle it. And what that'll do is the kind of the yeast that's in that bottle will wake up and eat that new sugar you just added and then make a little bit more alcohol. But the CO2 that inevitably carbonates that beer, it's called bottle conditioned. Tons of commercial breweries do it as well. Sierra Nevada is known for it. Victory's Brewing is known for bottle and can conditioning. I think if not everything, almost everything they produce.
Yeah, I know at one point I want to hear on an episode your story about Victory's conditioning.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We've talked
sure.
about them quite a few times.
Yes.
So let's take we kind of walked through on the last episode with Elliot from High Brewing. We talked about how you begin taking all the four main ingredients, taking them and turning them into a beer. And,
yes.
Not to say that it's easy, but it seems like you could make a beer in an hour and a half. How long does fermentation take? Can I microwave it and get an IPA out in maybe 4 or 5 hours? Have it ready for dinner.
Right.
Please don't judge me for
that. You're right. I don't know that. So you've kind of hit on all the important points, though. Is like temperature plays a role in this, a huge role in it, and so. We did a feature in the second season of Drinking Socially about the Kvik yeast from Norway and how that was kind of coming to the States. And usually breweries are fermenting beer. If it's an ale, between like 60 degrees and maybe if it's like a Belgian Saison, like 70, 75, maybe that's like scary high in the eye of a brewer. Well, these Kvik yeasts you can jack them up at like 92 or 100 degrees. And that does speed up the process. So you can make like an IPA with Kvik yeast and have it be done with primary fermentation in a day, which is pretty wild. It's going to be a vigorous fermentation. That brewhouse floor is going to be a mess with just what we call blow off, basically. As that yeast is eating all that sugar and making all that CO2. If it makes it really quick, it's going to, just like you open up a can of a beer and pour it too fast in your glass and it overflows. Same thing inside a huge tank full of thousands of gallons of beer. All that CO2 can be created so quickly, it's going to go all over the floor and make a mess. So, but you account for that as a brewer. You know what to do. So yeast plays a huge role. What kind you're using, temperature, absolutely. But primary fermentation, if you're not using the Kvik yeast, usually done in like 3 days or so. So it is very quick, but that wouldn't be like the appropriate time to bottle and give it to everybody. It's a new beer. It's got a lot of what we call secondary, fermentation to go through, where you want to, again, it's not just about the alcohol. It's about kind of making those flavors come together. Maybe you're dry hopping. Maybe it's a lager and it's got another 30 days to sit in another tank and clear up, have all that kind of particulate that you have that's in that beer from being brewed and being mashed, and have that drop out of suspension so you can see right through it. So there's those kinds of factors, but primary fermentation should be done in like 3 days or so. And then you've got all the alcohol that's going to be in there, provided you don't add some adjunct or something later, it's done. At that point, you're kind of just waiting for the flavors to come together.
Okay. So if we wanted to, if we were really in a hurry, we could be drinking a fresh made beer by this weekend.
Yes.
It probably just wouldn't taste maybe as good as most of the commercial beers we get.
Yeah.
But, sorry. the basic, just want to highlight this before we move on. The basic factors involved in that fermentation are the yeast, obviously, and the temperature. And does it matter like how much if I'm fermenting in my closet with 2 gallons versus in a giant 100-barrel fermenter?
Great question. So you're pitching a certain amount of yeast based on a couple factors. It's the size of the batch, so how much beer you're actually brewing. You need more yeast for more beer, or more wort to turn into beer. And then it's a generation of the yeast. So like, what's the viability? Like, how healthy is that yeast population? We'll repitch all the time in breweries where after primary fermentation is done, you can actually harvest the yeast out of the bottom of the fermenter through a sanitized equipment, and then use that yeast again in another beer. And yeast get better at their job the older they are. And so a generation is, you brew a beer, you pull the yeast out, you drop it in. That's from generation 1 to generation 2. And you do that from generation 2 to generation 3. Each time you put a new beer on top of it, it's considered a new generation of yeast that you're going to be pulling out of it. And so that's why breweries have labs. A big reason is to pull some yeast out of a beer, look at it under a microscope, count how active it is, what it's doing, and then you can based off that, determine, okay, this is how much of this yeast we're going to need to put into this next tank to hit our target, hit our final gravity, actually accomplish a full primary fermentation that gets that beer to where alcohol-wise we want it to be. And so, yeah, definitely some science happening.
Yep.
But it's pretty simple. You kind of, it's not, again, once you know what you're doing, it's all about, right, how much do you need? Measure these 3 things and add this amount.
So I can take it for granted and brew some beer at home and put it in my closet and measure yeast from a packet, and I can make. But man, when you were getting into it, that was getting very much like a chemistry course or a biology course, and it reminds me of a brewer. I won't mention him by name, but he wore incredibly short shorts.
Sure.
And he did get better with age, much like yeast.
Yeah.
But he told me about the rule of thumb, which we say many times. And according to legend, that stems from a brewer would stick his thumb in the mash, and he would use that to determine if this is the right temperature to pitch yeast, because it'll die or it won't work. If it's like,
right.
Knowing that maybe we don't use our thumbs to brew beer anymore.
Goodness.
What type of equipment goes in to doing this from a very scientific level, but try and keep it easy for me?
Sure. Yeah. Right. I mean, temperature is huge. And the microbiologist in me is screaming about sticking a thumb in a beer. Cause again, like after it's done boiling, anything that touches that beer could contaminate it. So you want to be really careful with it. But yeah, for commercial breweries, the yeast that you're getting is coming from established labs that handle yeast all day. White Labs is a big one. Y Yeast is a big one. There are a lot out there that supply commercial breweries and home brewers with these yeasts that they have studied, they have propagated. I mean, they've kind of grown in a lab under obviously very sanitized conditions, but they know a lot about them. So you've kind of given as a home brewer or a commercial brewer, if you decide to get this Czech lager yeast, it's going to tell you, well, this works really well at 58, between 57 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit is a good temperature to pitch this yeast at. And every commercial brewery knows the temperature of the tanks the yeast is going into. It's just a probe. You have a thermal probe in every tank that's measuring that. Home brewers, though, too, you get little strips that have a sticky back. You put them on your brew bucket, and it's just a thermometer. It tells you what temperature it is. So I can pitch now or not. Same with when you're cooling your beer down as a home brewer, commercial brewer, you're kind of watching the thermometer in the brew kettle drop down to 75 degrees or 70 degrees. Okay, now it's time to transfer it into my brew bucket or my fermenter because it's safe to pitch yeast. It's at a happy spot where the yeast is going to be most active, not overly active, give you weird off flavors, not based on that yeast, not fall asleep because it's too cold. Yeast do, when it gets cold, go to sleep and don't do what they're supposed to do. So they need to be happy. Okay, I said it before on this show. Our brewer's job is really just to make yeast happy, and temperature is a huge factor there.
Anyone that's experienced a northern winter can kind of
right
know what it feels
people
like.
And yeast, right? Very much the same.
Cold out. I'm not going out to shovel the driveway today. I want to ask you a question about dry hopping and how that affects fermentation, but because we're trying to keep these weekly episodes short, let's move that and maybe add that question to the final Beer 101.
Yeah, or even lagering next time we do Beer 101 or cellaring or whatever. We can jump into that. That's great.
Perfect. And in that case, my last question for you on fermentation. So provided everything kind of works out, the yeasts do their job, the temperature stays at a good place. I know this term green beer. So provided, like if we rushed through and we used a Kvec yeast and we did a 3-day IPA and we've got this green beer, what do you do to kind of get it ready for commercial sale or for the shelf at the grocery store?
Yeah. So, right. You want to have that kind of secondary fermentation run its course. If you need to dry hop, that's when your dry hopping is kind of right at the end or well after primary fermentation. Breweries do it differently based on a fair amount of factors. And that's kind of like the grandma's meatloaf recipe is like, that's different brewery to brewery is what's good. How much ketchup? Is it actually barbecue sauce? What are we putting in here to make this meatloaf great? So when they dry hop, that's taken into consideration. But probably what's most, as you said, I mean, you could make a beer in like 10 days as a commercial brewery that you could package. Now, could and should are the, at that moment, very different words. And you want to, as they usually always are, but you want to kind of put that into consideration of, should we wait another week? Should we cold crash this? I mean, every beer we made in Chamonix Creek, we would cold crash. It's tell you what it sounds. We get very cold, and that helps drop a lot of stuff, particulates, proteins. Yeast has been kicked up thanks to dry hopping. Dry hops itself, the hops themselves, out of the suspension of the beer, so that when you package it, it looks great. It doesn't look like weird pond water, which no one's going to want to drink. So cold crashing's a big part of this. And then, after that, you're transferring into a bright tank, which is just a giant tank used basically to bottle, can, or keg off of. And that's it. I mean, at that point, you package your beer and it's ready to be consumed, which is something we'll get into coming up on not the next Beer 101. I think are we 2 Beer 101s away from packaging, or is it right?
I believe
Perfect.
You're right. Next one's going to be cellaring and lagering, and then we'll get into packaging.
So
you made when we covered packaging, there's a story about Heady Topper. And on the can saying drink this from the can.
Right.
Rumor has it that's because the beer at that time was one of the first hazy IPAs that looked like pond water.
It was a chunky IPA, yeah.
You were encouraged to keep it in the can and then just enjoy the flavor.
Yeah.
This has been great, Harrison. I want to encourage anybody to go back and listen to Harrison pronounce Ordinem Ecentrici Coctores.
We both nailed
the
it.
Proper Latin name of OEC if you need some motivation to get through the week. Thanks for listening us to drink this Coolship fermented dark lager and actually learn about how fermentation works. Harrison, what's coming up next week?
Yeah, so next week, we're coming back with again episodes every week now. So we're saying next week, you're not mishearing us. Next week we'll be back. So tune in next Wednesday. We're going to drink Spaten's Oktoberfest and talk about how cool it'd be to go to Germany itself and run around with some schnitzel and some lederhosen and have a good old time.
Outside of that, the show notes for this episode and all our episodes are available on our new landing page at podcast.untapped.com. If you have any questions or feedback, just head there and you can connect directly with us right through Untapped or link up with us on the Drinking Socially Facebook group.
Yeah. And
otherwise, thanks for listening.
Yeah, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Cheers.